We're probably going to have to cut this part, but we get some pretty bad reactions.
No, you don't have to cut this part if you want to. I'll explicitly say that if your culture is racist, that culture sucks.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the books? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the hook!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Welcome back to Propaganda Loves You, everyone. My name is Joe. I'm joined again by my co-hosts Arthur and Kodie. We are having our second conversation about When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katznelson. Last time on Book Club, we talked about the introduction chapter and chapter 1 and 2, I guess, which sort of set the stage for the whole history of affirmative action, of the New Deal era, of all these big federal programs that were supposed to level the economic field between white and black communities in between World War I and World War II. And this week, we're getting into more of the World War II era. So the tail end of that interwar period before World War II really kicks off, and then some of the things that were going on in the economy and in the military and in labor practices and all sorts of things dealing with the war economy and then the aftermath of the war economy, the GI Bill, how that was manipulated, as well as all these other programs. So yeah, today we're going to get into more of the World War II era of this conversation and talk about Katznelson's argument extends through that era as well, in terms of having a federal program set up that on the surface intentionally is supposed to benefit black people and communities that have been historically oppressed. And on the insider level of government, how those programs have been manipulated to maintain the status quo, to keep poor black communities down, and to benefit white communities specifically. Just as an aside, something I thought we could talk about before we get into any quotes or commentary or anything, the title of the book I've been thinking about a lot more as we're reading When Affirmative Action Was White. And I don't know. I feel like it's almost mistitled in a way. The more I read in this book, the more I feel like I'm thinking about the intention behind some of these actions he's talking about. And it seems to me, this is just kind of my hot take, that a more appropriate title for the book, although not as easy to say, would be When Affirmative Action Was Anti-Black. Because I think that's more intentionally what's going on here. I don't really see some of these things as, gee, guys, how can we work together and try to help white people specifically? I think it seems more like, let's do what we can to keep black people in their place, to keep benefiting from the cheap, basically free labor. Like the intent, I don't know, does that make sense? The intention I'm talking about seems more oriented towards anti-blackness than pro-whiteness necessarily. Mm-hmm. Is that just quibbling, or does that feel like a meaningful difference?
No, I was just thinking through, because I'm sure there's a couple quotes here or areas that I highlighted. What struck me for these chapters, and thinking back to the ones that we talked about previously, is how much the politicians and people in Congress refer back to black people in terms of labor. That's the main argument that comes through. Some of the quotes I pulled out were concerns about not having enough black people to work in the farms, and like, oh, well, if we have them elevated to own their own farms, are they going to be able to work on white farms? Or if black women have money, they no longer want to take menial, labor jobs, like working. Like, it was all really at that lens of labor. And, this first, I think, chapter that we're talking about, chapter 3 with the unions, kind of solidified that in my mind, right? Like with how this was presented, I guess. So I agree.
Yeah, definitely. It reinforced like a racial caste system, and it definitely divided labor into like a two-tiered system, and they more excluded and I think were more focused on the anti-black measures. It's like, it should be called like Affirmative Action is Racist still. It's a really interesting title.
Yeah, and I understand why he wrote the title the way he did too, because like listening back to that first conversation we had, like the cultural notion about affirmative action is immediately like, it's a program set up to benefit black people because of history, right? And so you flip it to make it make sense. But it is wild just how much of it is just explicitly anti-Black. So let's jump into it. I just have little nuggets and areas to start on. If you guys feel like a redirect to a different quote you have pulled, feel free to jump when that seems appropriate. This chapter 3, Rules for Work, gets more into the nuts and bolts of the legislation of how things were worded explicitly to exclude Black people based on work categories. Like we said in the last episode, they didn't need to say no Black people. They could just say no agricultural workers, no domestic workers, and everyone knew what they meant. And to sort of get us going on this theme, there's a couple of parts I wanted to read from. So I'm on pages 58, 59, 60, and there are a couple of quotes here. One is from Gardner Jackson, chairman of the National Committee on Rural and Social Planning, a labor-oriented advocacy organization. So he was testifying before Congress on this labor bill, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I'm just going to read this quote. This from his testimony here. He says, "No purpose will be served by beating around the bush. You, Mr. Chairman, and all your associates on this committee know as well as I do that agricultural laborers have been explicitly excluded from participation in any of the benefits of New Deal legislation, from the late but not greatly lamented NRA down through the Wagner-Connery Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act, for this simple and effective reason that it has been deemed politically certain that their inclusion would have spelled death of the legislation in Congress. And now, in this proposed Black-Connery wages and hours bill, agricultural laborers are again explicitly excluded." This person, Gardner Jackson, is calling out the fact that Southern Democrats basically will, as a rule, kill anything that threatens the labor force in the South. And Florida Representative James Mark Wilcox, his quote, sort of underscores this point in a really kind of alarming way. It takes you back to some of the explicit language that was used at the time and how much racism is still very much alive today. But in a lot of ways, the way people talk about it, they try to be sneaky, do sort of linguistic gymnastics to avoid saying what they really feel. This is back in the 1930s. Florida Representative James Mark Wilcox. Here's a quote from him. He says, "There is another matter of great importance in the South, and that is the problem of our Negro labor. There has always been a difference in the wage scale of white and colored labor. So long as Florida people are permitted to handle the matter, the delicate and perplexing problem can be adjusted. But the federal government knows no color line, and of necessity it cannot make any distinction between the races. We may rest assured, therefore, that when we turn over to a federal bureau or board the power to fix wages, it will prescribe the same wage for the Negro that it prescribes for the white man. Now, such a plan might work in some sections of the United States, but those of us who know the true situation know that it just will not work in the South. You cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it." So just a clear example of what was alluded to in the previous chapters. I don't know, how does this moment in history land with you guys?
It's funny, I actually had that quote highlighted as well. And the reason that I had that one highlighted was kind of because, in the first couple chapters, it was more implied. I'm sure there were debates that included the same kind of language, but here it's explicit, right? Like it's no longer just like, oh, we're going to leave this working class out. It's like explicitly, you can't have a system in the South where it's equal treatment. It was basically what he's saying, or equal pay. And just straight up admitting like, hey, that's not going to work, and anything that goes that direction is going to be dead in Congress, right? It's kind of like what comes out to me anyway. Yeah, so that definitely kind of struck a chord when I read it as well.
It's not like accidental oversight to have this in a bill. It's definitely intentional, and the exclusions are like foundational to our modern capitalism, like racism as it exists, and how it completely correlates to the white middle class. Just very explicit, and kind of the same like political language tools. Like it's a delicate and perplexing problem, but the state can handle it. And they say, but those of us who know the true situation. I thought of Donald Trump immediately.
Yeah, I read these chapters before I saw the movie Sinners. It recently came available on streaming. I don't know if you guys seen Sinners yet.
Haven't watched it yet. I hear it's great.
Yeah,
It's
same.
really good. Like Ryan Coogler, the director, did a bunch of other movies that were really good. Fruitvale Station was a really good one. Then he did the Wakanda movies, did a movie with Creed. He always cast Michael B. Jordan as like one of his leads. But Sinners was really, really good. And one of the things that struck me was because it's from this era of history, really. A lot of it is set in like the 1930s, Prohibition era, Depression era, rural Mississippi Delta area. And so a lot of the characters are sharecroppers on plantations. Michael B. Jordan in the film, he plays a set of twins, so he's two characters, which is really interesting how they shoot some of that stuff. But one of the main premises of the plot is he's trying to establish this juke joint for the local black community. So they buy a building, they set up this juke joint, they're trying to get musicians and people to come. And when the party gets going and they have the community and buying drinks and stuff, they're sort of checking the till to see how much money they're making. And they're realizing that a lot of the people that come are paying in scrip. They're not paying in like actual cash because the plantations they work on are not paying them in actual cash. They're paying them in this fake script that only works in their local little area to control their buying power in the economy. And they have this conversation about, what do we do? Do we accept this? And like, they work their ass off all day for these little, fake dollars. And that's the situation these sharecroppers were facing. So when we're talking about people who were excluded from New Deal legislation, it's people like this who are effectively not much better off than slaves were 60 years before that. So it's just a moment where art and history kind of come together in an interesting way to drive home a point. Highly recommend people see that movie.
Which is, well, now I'm just guessing here. I'm trying to remember, but the Fair Labor Standards Act, because I highlighted a couple things here. That was 1938. That was the one that I think they were talking about in the first quote. But yeah, what was it? I'm just going to read this because it was, enacted the landmark Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 to eradicate labor conditions detrimental to the maintenance of the minimum standards of living necessary for health, efficiency, and well-being of workers. The act established a minimum wage of 25 cents per hour for the first year following passage, 30 cents for the second year, and 40 cents within a 6-year period. Also provided maximum working hours of 44 hours per week. This eventually goes down to 40 hours per week thereafter, and prohibited child labor in industries engaging in producing goods in interstate commerce. So I guess my question, then it goes to say what was excluded from that, right? Like that's what enabled exactly what you're talking about, right, Joe? Otherwise they would have to pay them. Like there would be the minimum wage. You can't have kids working, right? Yeah, it's crazy.
I don't know if there's anything in this chapter that I really want to read necessarily. I think my main question for this chapter has to do with the intersection of race and work, of like, from a propaganda lens, like maybe the answer feels obvious, but maybe we can talk about why we aren't taught to talk about race and labor in the same sentence. Why are we not taught to put these things together in a meaningful way? What's the propaganda going on there?
I think I have an answer from the book, but unless you
That counts. That counts.
Yeah. Well, I think like in the book, it was talking about how during World War II, when a lot of more manufacturing jobs and things or jobs that were included in these earlier laws, right? Like that weren't excluded because the labor market needed more people. A lot more Black people were moving into those jobs where they could actually unionize, right? And so union growth in the South during that time. And I think the quote, I can't find it in the book just yet, but I think the quote was something around the lines of essentially white workers and Black workers were starting to realize that it was advantageous for them to work together. They had more power when they were working collectively rather than separately. And so kind of extrapolating from that quote, it's like, if you're using race as a way to divide people, then it's a way to maintain power at the ownership level, right? Like in solidarity between the working class would create more problems for the owning class there. So I don't know. That's my initial thought on that.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. I think also a bit about protecting the mythology of the American dream and pull yourself up from your bootstraps, and these white people are, I pull myself up from my bootstraps and I'm a self-made man instead of daddy owned a plastics factory and now I'm a millionaire, or I own mines and now I'm a billionaire, whatever. And so I think like protecting that too, and then yeah, totally about like keeping people just completely divided for control.
Yeah, the
And
union history is crazy because like union organizing got started in like northern industrial areas. And or I can't maybe I can I don't know if this quote will be exactly what we're looking for here, but on page 73 they're sort of talking about some of this stuff. The National Labor Relations Board being established and what to do about union organizing and things. So I'm just going to read this paragraph at the top of 73. It says, as sponsors, Howard Smith, in partnership with Senator Tom Connolly of Texas, also gave the War Labor Disputes Act a Southern pedigree. To bring the unions under control, they and their Southern colleagues supported increasing federal administrative authority over the labor relationship by giving statutory authority to a war labor board, authorizing the president to seize and operate struck plants, requiring a 30-day notice to the NLRB prior to striking in a labor dispute which might interrupt war production, mandating a secret strike ballot on the 30th day of the dispute had not been resolved, and prohibiting labor organizations from making national election political contributions. And so that might not be explicitly what we're looking for, but it points to this thing about being hesitant to organize in the South because they knew politically that it would mean they would lose support federally if they try to tamper with the Southern labor market. But the theme you're pointing to of how white and black workers realize at a certain point, hey, it's actually better for all of us if we start to work together. This happens again and again and again in American history. If you go to Howard Zinn's history book, it's like pre-government times, like in colonial America times. The same situation was happening of like indigenous people, women, slaves trying to sort of figure out how to work together to correct their situation, and then the colonial overlords just like slamming their fists down and stopping it. And you just see the same thing happen over and over again. Here we are in the 1930s. It's the same thing happening again.
actually, it's funny, Joe, I also highlighted the paragraph right below that because it was talking about the language that was utilized by Southerners. So I'll just read this out and see if there's any comparisons we could make. But the language utilized by the Southerners was anxious and inflammatory, referring to wartime strikes, especially by the CIO and the mine workers who had recently left the CIO. Southern members characterized union leaders as criminally corrupt racketeers, goon squads, lacking in patriotism under conditions of war crisis, and communistic and dictatorial. That struck me just because I remember growing up, and I don't remember the context, but people complaining about unions, and it's always corruption. It's always like, these, and that's not to say there isn't corruption in some unions. Like you see some of those union leaders and you're like, what on earth are they doing? But at the same time, it's definitely a tool that's used to kind of discredit and try and make people not want to join those unions, right? And I did find the quote that I was trying to find earlier. So it's page 70. It's like a second paragraph. It says, because the Negro constitutes a relatively large and permanent part of Southern industrial labor force in such industries as tobacco, lumber, and iron and steel, duty noted, successful unionization of such industries requires the organization of colored workers, adding that based on wartime experience, including experiments with multiracial union locals, there is evidence to the effect that workers among both races are beginning to realize that economic cooperation is not only possible, but desirable. I think that was the big takeaway for me from this chapter, was really just like, as soon as the Southern Democrats got what they wanted out of the initial New Deal, Fair Deal legislation, and as soon as the demographics started to change and the black population was being able to organize and get more power, they immediately attacked those unions and the ability to generate power. That was kind of like my big takeaway from this chapter.
Yeah, it was crazy to see how power reacts when they start to realize people putting the dots together. We can see a lot of that going on right now, like even with just, I probably don't want to get into it in a book club episode, but all the stuff going on in LA recently of like just how many different narratives you see coming together among the people organizing to protect their communities. They're very well aware of the interconnection of different struggles. And it's an exciting moment because you see people sort of waking up to a deeper reality of oppression, but it's scary because this is the moment where the fascists tend to slam their foot down. And I'm just like terrified about how many people are going to get, kidnapped or killed or hurt or whatever. But we see, another moment in history where like people say history happens in cycles and stuff, and it's kind of true, but it's like a distorted mirror. Like you get to look at the same moment again, and it's slightly different. It's twisted somehow, but some of the same stuff is always going on. I kind of want to pivot to chapter 4 now, unless you guys have other things you wanted to mention from chapter 3. Got you.
There's only one other quote that I kind of want to talk about, and the reason I wanted to hit on this one is because in the first episode, I think I said something like we should probably talk about at some point the change in parties like Southern Democrats, how they kind of shifted over, and this starts to cover that, right? Like in this chapter, like the quote or the part that I wanted to read is on page 74, and it says, we thus and prior to this, just to set the context for why this was all talking about like how the Southern Democrats were going after union and labor organization. And then it goes into this paragraph, but it says, we thus can see how the coalition that Southern members had begun to fashion with Republicans on labor union issues in 1939 grew to almost unanimous solidarity during and especially just after the Second World War. The motivation for this dramatic shift was a deep concern about union power, its growing role in the region, and its potential impact on the racial order. So I think like, that really kind of sets the stage for how that occurred and what it was that drove that change in my mind a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good analytical point from Katznelson. And so I'm thinking like this moment in history, World War II is starting to become more and more obvious. If you're a Black person living in this time, you realize, if you're in the South especially, that economically, like there's no shot of having a dignified life. You might start looking elsewhere. What opportunities are there? And so a lot of Black people turn to military service as a way of trying to, the same strategy I had out of high school. I felt economically kind of stuck in my hometown situation. I was looking for an escape. Terry offered to pay for college, and I was like, let's go, let's do it. And so people will use these opportunities to sort of get themselves out of difficult economic circumstances. Chapter 4 is about, it's titled Divisions in War, and it's about the sort of surge of recruitment of Black people specifically into the military and the military's efforts to do integration and how messy and weird and just kind of screwed up a lot of that stuff got. And from a broad perspective, it's almost, again, it's kind of like from a big perspective, it seems like something that's kind of nice. And then you get into the details of it and you start to see how messy and kind of insidious a lot of it was. And so kind of the first quote I want to go to is on page 99. But just to sort of set the context, the Department of Defense was not always called the Department of Defense. That in and of itself is a bit of propaganda. It used to be more accurately called the War Department, because that's its purpose, is to do war. So the War Department had all of these sort of training manuals and guidelines and things that they put out to sort of prepare officers and people who train troops basically for how to integrate, or in which ways to integrate Black troops into the armed forces. And so on page 99, there's a quote from this Army War College training manual that was preparing instructors for an influx of Black troops. And it summarized the predominant view that underpinned these various decisions. And so this quote is from that Army War College training manual. It says, as an individual, the Negro is docile, tractable, light-hearted, carefree, and good-natured. If unjustly treated, he is likely to become surly and stubborn, though this is usually a temporary phase. He is careless, shiftless, irresponsible, and secretive. He resents censure and is best handled with praise and by ridicule. He is unmoral, untruthful, and his sense of right-doing is relatively inferior. On the other hand, the Negro is cheerful, loyal, and usually uncomplaining if reasonably well fed. He has a musical nature and a marked sense of rhythm. His art is primitive. He is religious. With proper direction and mass, Negroes are industrious. They are emotional and can be stirred to a high state of enthusiasm. Their emotions are unstable and their reactions uncertain. What an absolutely diabolical thing to have in a federal government document about how to train people who are offering their service to you. They're volunteering their lives, right? When you sign up for the military, there's an implicit understanding. I might get sent somewhere where I could get killed. Like, these people are basically volunteering their life to you and a chance to hopefully improve their situation. And this is the way behind the scenes they're being talked about. I just really want to emphasize how diabolical this language is.
Yeah, I guess like for me, this entire chapter was interesting because where my head goes with this is just thinking back to when I was active duty. The thing that everyone always talked about is military readiness and making sure you're the most lethal and most ready for any situation. And you're using all the things that you can to do that. At least that was the rhetoric that I was used to seeing. And just reading through this is like, oh, we're not doing that at all, right? We're taking this group of people that are volunteering their time to go fight a war, and we are giving them suboptimal training, like locations, wouldn't even have them. It was talking a lot about the military bases in the South that had literally just segregated bases, right? They wouldn't even have them in the same location, even if there was space for them in those bases for training and whatnot. And so that just kind of struck my head as like, we're really like in that scenario, not doing everything they could to actually go after or to actually prepare for war. But later on, it talks about how the population of Black service members increased significantly. And it was mostly like they didn't have a choice, right? They needed people. And that's actually what gave more opportunity, which I thought was really interesting. Like, oh, you're forced into this. And then you realize, oh, this is a strategic advantage, not something for us to try to diminish, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I liked how Ira Katznelson earlier, he kind of said like how the military wanted to expand Plessy v. Ferguson, which was like the Supreme Court case that addressed separate but equal, and put that into the military sphere, and how it kind of turned the entire military into this Jim Crow institute. And yeah, like exactly what you're saying with like their labor, like they can only have like these menial jobs. They're ostracized at these bases. And then later on, he even gets into statistics, and one of them was the number of officers out of like 250,000 or something. It was like a handful. And yeah, totally continues today with like the DEI thought, I guess, being put onto that.
Yeah, and they're like really sensitive about trying not to upset white troops and stuff. And so like Black officers couldn't be in charge of white troops, or the lengths they go to protect the racial order and all this. And like you're saying, the idea publicly is that we're all about readiness and being prepared to fight, but you're explicitly doing things that separate people in weird ways, make it less efficient. Even though you want to recruit Black people, you're really weird about what jobs you'll let them do or not do. And you're not actually making use of, and I hate this phrase, but your human resources. I think human resources is a disgusting phrase, but in this sense, it kind of makes sense. You're trying to get a bunch of people to fight a war. How can I use these people to best fight that war? And then you're making all these weird little racist, petty decisions that just gum up the process. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Cody.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this really kind of nailed home for me too, just institutional racism, like what that means, right? Like, because it can be a trigger word for some people, because it's like, what do you mean everything? It's like, well, I don't think that's saying that every person today that's involved is racist. It's how these things were set up structurally, right? Like, was explicitly to like exclude the Black race. Like, I don't really know how you could label it anything other than institutional racism at that point. But I mean, this does do a great job of laying that out and like explaining what that really is without ever saying that, right?
Yeah, he makes an interesting point at the beginning of section. It's on page 102 and 103. I'm kind of just skimming it again now. I don't know if there's a quote I want to read from it. I guess I can just kind of paraphrase the point. So in this point in the history of World War II, all of the recruitment for the military, the wartime economy, offered a lot of opportunities for groups who had been oppressed in some ways to sort of make improvements in their situation. A lot more women got into the workforce where they had been forced into domestic roles beforehand. Black people got opportunities to get out of their Southern oppression and get into the world, get some kind of training from the military and get other kinds of jobs. And Jews also were a group who before World War II were very oppressed in the United States and used opportunities in the war to improve their situation. So this section on 102 and 103, he's sort of talking about how much more easy Jewish people were integrated into the military and given opportunities to advance their situation. And he's sort of doing a compare and contrast to the failure of integration for Black troops compared to the easily smooth, acceptable integration of Jewish troops into the armed forces. I just thought that was another example of how it is an obviously racist kind of thing we're dealing with. Oh, you look like white people? Okay, you're white people. Like at a certain point in history, Italians are no longer Italians, they're white people. At a certain point in history, Jewish people are white people. I know some Jewish people still dispute that, but yeah, it really is about the skin color sometimes and the history that goes along with all of that. So I just wanted to point that out as another example of like, it's not just that they didn't want new types of people in general in the military. They specifically did not want more Black people in positions of power or control or authority in the military.
I guess I did want to mention, I think what the other thing that Katznelson does that I like, we're talking about a lot of, I think, the more important aspects like that we're bringing up here of, where it was unjust or where it was, racist policy. But there were like good things that did come out of this too. And he highlights those things. One of the things I wanted to highlight was, this is on page 108, but it was talking about how like trying to get more recruits in, a lot of people were illiterate to the point where they couldn't be recruited, right? And so I'll just read this really quick. So the Army's response was to create a massive crash schooling program of special training units at the military reception centers, organized into segregated classrooms. 2 out of every 3 of their students were Black. Once in place, starting in June 1943, more than 300,000 inductees passed through the program. Half came from the 4th Service Command that recruited in the Deep South. A high portion, 11% of new white recruits were classified as illiterate, but fully 45% of Black newcomers lacked basic reading skills. And then it goes through some talking about like the actual program, like what it was, 12 weeks and whatnot. But then it says, remarkably, the great majority, some 250,000, were lifted out of illiteracy in this brief period. Of the Black members of these special training units in the first 6 months of operation, fully 90% were assigned to regular units at the conclusion of their schooling, a higher portion than 85% of whites. I just thought this was super interesting, right? Like out of necessity for recruits, the Army did the right thing. Kind of like they created this thing and did create opportunity there. I just appreciate that Katznelson didn't leave out some things that were good too, right? That's definitely a good thing to understand, regardless of the intention initially.
Yeah. I don't have anything for that. I just have my last thought on this chapter was how there's kind of like a contrast between abroad, they're fighting fascism, and then at home, it's reinforcing white supremacy within the structure of military. So it's kind of like that strange dichotomy. And even today, in some wars, you could look at that and see how we're claiming to free people from fascism, and yet the structures in place for us are still tied to these institutional racisms and sexisms and things like that under those categories. That's what
that definitely popped out to me. Like just, it's hypocrisy. I don't even know if that's the right word in this scenario. I feel like there's got to be some better word for institutional hypocrisy. I don't know.
Yeah, that's like, I'm trying to find a way to integrate both things you guys are saying. Because I agree, Kodie. I really appreciate how nuanced Katznelson is in this. Like, he's a very, very deep, like, he's an academic. He's good at what he does. He has very, very detailed analyses of this situation. He points out everything that's horrible about it. And he points out the progress that was actually made. Like, people were lifted out of illiteracy and took advantage of opportunities to escape poverty and these things. And a lot of these programs really did help people. It's a difficult but necessary skill to learn to hold both of those truths at the same time, to understand what is still, fucked up and oppressive about a situation, and also recognize where potential gains lie. And we have to do both of those things in history and in the present. And it gets the U.S. government into these sticky propaganda situations where they have these ideals that they espouse abroad, like we're the land of the free and all this stuff. But you can go back and look at Soviet propaganda of how easy it was for the Soviets to just point this out again and again. And they were like, oh, you Soviets, you're starving people, you're kicking out these people, you're doing this and that. And they would just put out these posters like, why do you still hate black people? Why are you still segregated? Why are you still, pointlessly being mean to black people? Like, it's just such an easy hypocrisy to point out with this country. It's our country's great stain. We still haven't removed it. Yeah, like it's just wild to see.
Joe, you said that was during the Soviet time frame, but that's one of the main divisive issues that modern Russian disinformation went after, was driving both, like trying to create further tension in that racial area, and then immigration, right? Like those are some of the big themes that they try to hit on and make that gap even wider, make that division even wider. So it's like, it hasn't stopped. It's still there. It's still a venue that others use to create devices.
I mean, a wise country would take care of that and make sure that it couldn't be something that could be used against it.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're living in a very wise country right now.
Yeah.
Is there anything else about the war specifically that we want to talk about before we start talking about GI Bill stuff?
I guess for me, this is the one that I didn't feel like I was as surprised when I was reading this. And maybe that's just because there's been a lot of movies out there on how black troops were treated, right? Like the jobs that they were given. So I don't think that this chapter surprised me as much as some of the other ones, like more about policy, because this felt to me more about how at the time the military had to transition from essentially being a Jim Crow military, right, to integrated. And I think he did call out, I don't know if it was in this chapter or another one, but like by the 60s and 70s, like that the U.S. military was probably the best integrated like portion of the U.S. government. So like, I thought that was interesting, right? Like it details like all the issues that were had, and then it says like, yeah, and eventually they got to the point where it was probably the best representation of actual equality, like in the U.S. government at the time. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Yeah, I think that was it for me. I was trying to think about how the military kind of, I guess, like it seems like they recruit from these marginalized communities still and kind of profit off of that still.
Yeah. And it puts these gains that we get in a cynical light. Like there are good things you get out of it, and they know that, right? And they make those things available as incentives explicitly to like, come on, join the military. We need more bodies to do war with. Like, we need you guys. So here's some free college. Here's care, which is an amazing healthcare program, which only the military has access to. I wonder why. They have childcare on bases. I don't know. I'm not a parent, but I assume that there's some childcare situation where you're not paying a second mortgage for your kids to have a babysitter during the day. And there's stuff going on now with like the Job Corps program. The federal, it was like a way for young poor people to get job training and to get access to careers and stuff. And it's kind of just been shut down.
Yeah.
And so like if poor people have no meaningful way to enter the economy, they're either going to commit crimes to take care of themselves and their families, or they're going to volunteer for the military, which will give them a bunch of free shit. And both of those things are good for the fascists in power because you need troops. And we live in a industrialized for-profit prison system that needs bodies to do. I mean, kind of getting ahead of myself. I wanted to ask this question at the end, but what's essentially slave labor still. So yeah, it is wild. It is wild. So the GI Bill, which I love, and I'm very
great
grateful
transition.
for. Chapter 5 is called White Veterans Only, and it largely has to do with this huge GI Bill legislation that lifted so many troops out of poverty, gave them access to the middle class. They were able to get mortgages, build houses, go to school, all these wonderful things that made the post-war economy so impressive in historical light. So to get us started on this, I'm going to read the first paragraph of this chapter and then a little bit from the 2 pages after, 114 and 115. And then, I don't know, we can go wherever you guys want from there. I'll read those and then we'll see where the conversation goes. So beginning of chapter 5, Katznelson says, no other New Deal initiative has had as great an impact on changing the country as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. Aimed at reintegrating 16 million veterans, it reached 8 to 10 men born during the 1920s. Even today, this legislation, which quickly came to be called the GI Bill of Rights, qualifies as the most wide-ranging set of social benefits ever offered by the federal government in a single comprehensive initiative. Between 1944 and 1971, federal spending for former soldiers in this model welfare system totaled over $95 billion. By 1948, 15% of the federal budget was devoted to the GI Bill, and the Veterans Administration employed 17% of the federal workforce. So he goes on to talk about all of the praise for the GI Bill, of how politicians through the ages have used the GI Bill as an example of the great work that the federal government can do. And he has this quote from President Clinton talking about how President Clinton said it raised the entire nation to a plateau of social well-being never before experienced in U.S. history. And then I'm continuing at the second to last paragraph on 114. Katznelson says, the entire nation? This oft-repeated claim is remarkably misleading. To be sure, the GI Bill did create a more middle-class society, but almost exclusively for whites. Written under Southern auspices, the law was deliberately designed to accommodate Jim Crow. Its administration widened the country's racial gap. The prevailing experience for blacks was starkly differential treatment. At the time, some observers noticed, 2 years after the passage of the GI Bill, Truman Gibson Jr., veterans editor for the Pittsburgh Courier, documented, quote, the sorry plight of Negro veterans, and particularly those living in the South, in a story headlined, Government Fails Negro Vets. He lamented how the Veterans Program had completely failed veterans of minority races, unquote. The next year, Our Negro Veterans, a fact-filled report, drew attention to a profound crisis for black ex-soldiers. Summarizing studies conducted by the Bureau of the Census, the Southern Regional Council, an interracial group that promoted gradual change, the National Urban League, and the American Veterans Committee, whose active membership included FDR and Ronald Reagan, it observed, this is a quote from that report, there are two major sets of facts surrounding the life of Negro veterans in America today. One, over 1 million dark-skinned ex-servicemen are, by training, discipline, sacrifice, and determination, prepared for integration into the nation's life as first-class citizens. Two, the nation has almost universally failed to grasp the enormous opportunity which is presented through veterans' benefits for this minority group. It was, the document concluded, as though the GI Bill had been earmarked for white veterans only. How could a program so unparalleled and so inclusive be understood so quickly and with good reason as a policy for white veterans only?
Yeah, which is like interesting just for how they kind of talk about the bill beforehand, how it's like better than previous legislation. Like it's not excluding any work roles. It's not doing anything like that. Like it on paper, should be an equal law. But yeah, then we get into the execution and who actually allows that, which is like the same exact tactic, right? Like it just repeats over and over again. It's crazy. Oh yeah, this is what I'm talking about. The new law was more than the most comprehensive public policy to the moment in American history. It also was formally the most democratic. Unlike Social Security or legislation for minimum wages and maximum hours, no one was excluded who had served at least 90 days on active duty and had received other than dishonorable discharge. Irrespective of region, class, ethnicity, race, all veterans were equally recognized as entitled to the bounty of social rights. The GI Bill's remarkable array of advantages for American troops contained not a single loophole for different treatment of white and black veterans. And as Michael Bennett put it, it was America's first colorblind social legislation. So the question that he asked, how do you go from that to something that's for whites only, and how it lays that out is really interesting in the rest of this chapter. So
yeah, it's like trying to figure out how the magician does it. I know he's tricking me somehow, but how is he doing that?
Yeah. Any of these federally funded and state and locally enforced bills, they're so problematic.
Yeah, and it was, there's another quote later on, but I can hold off if you guys want to give anything else on there.
And the main thing I wanted to point to was, this chapter is really a story about the man behind the curtain. In this case, House of Representative member named John Rankin of Mississippi. So he talks about the Committee on World War legislation in the House of Representatives, which was responsible for writing this whole bill, and the chairman was John Rankin of Mississippi. Rankin was one of the chamber's most unashamed racists. He was something of a thug, openly anti-black, anti-Jewish, and anti-Catholic. Guided by the model of administrative decentralization that the South had achieved in earlier New Deal laws, Rankin led the drafting of a law that left responsibility for implementation mainly to the states and localities, including, of course, those that practice official racism without compromise.
Yeah. So it's like take the New Deal, take the Fair Deal, basically playbook, right? And okay, so we'll write this legislation and make it look as absolutely colorblind as possible, but yeah, in the execution of it, like they've kind of solidified that as the go-to move, right? Like you can write whatever you want at the federal level, but just like you said, Arthur, if it's local or state that's on to actually enforce that, then yeah, what happens next? Well, we see what happens next, I guess.
Yeah, I remember somewhere he wrote about how Rankin said something about how the federal power shouldn't be used to like upset or challenge the racial customs of the South. It's always heritage and customs.
That's a really weird word for racism. Customs, like, like I don't know.
It's just our culture.
Yeah.
That culture sucks.
Yeah,
Sorry.
like the reaction that gets though, like when you start talking, I don't know, it's crazy. I don't know. We're probably gonna have to cut this part, but it gets some pretty bad reactions.
No, you don't have to cut this part if you want to. I'll explicitly say that if your culture is racist, that culture sucks.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's just my opinion. Did the work of making sure that however this bill was put into law, like the feds are not going to control it. And if there are feds, like the Veterans Administration that are involved, I want to make sure that they don't do anything I don't like. So there's this exchange, there are all these hearings whenever a bill is proposed. The committees will have hearings and they'll have experts from the different institutions come and testify and stuff. And so they had the head of the VA, I think, trying to get the name straight here. Yeah, General Frank Hines, who is the head of the VA when this was all happening. This is all on page 127. Basically, Rankin is trying to question the head of the VA and say, I want to make sure that you guys aren't going to use this to do any racial leveling. We want to make sure that the VA is not going to do anything like that. Frank Yates, head of the VA, Katznelson says here, he took trouble to reassure not just the interstate conference, but Congressman Rankin specifically and other Southern members that the VA's administration of unemployment insurance for Black veterans would not undercut Southern labor markets. He reassured them, no matter what we're doing, we might try to help some Black people, but we're going to make sure we do it in a way that does not interrupt your bottom line on those plantations in the South. So my question, really, are we sure that the South lost the Civil War?
Right.
Like, are we sure about that? I don't know. I'm less convinced the more I learn.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like at every turn, we have to accommodate whatever they want. And it continues today, even though like federal dollars come from like, a few states from the majority they tend to be more liberal leaning, like California and New York. It's still like, we still have a claim. And it's true with the Senate. Like they get 2 senators for each state, even though their populations are nowhere near other places. So I don't know. I agree with you. And all the statues are going back up. Like
we only took 175-ish year pause. That's or it was just 175-ish year Cold War. I don't know. But yeah, what is it saying, Joe? You're pretty sure you grew up with us in North Carolina. The South will rise again. Like that's, tongue in cheek, but maybe not.
No, they're pretty serious about that shit.
Yeah.
Legislatively, you can trace this pattern, and we've done a lot of it in this book, but anything going from the 13th Amendment, honestly, we can start there going all the way to now. There's a pattern of states' rights. In general, we don't want the federal government to be the big authority. We want to give individual states the right to do whatever. That pattern of letting individual states do what they want on these issues is a pattern that began and continues to accommodate the South in a lot of ways, to accommodate capitalists specifically who want to exploit racial hierarchies to the benefit of their surplus value, their shareholders. The example I was thinking about was Obamacare, right? This whole thing about a federal program to provide what we hoped was a single payer option to give everyone access to healthcare, not only do we not get the single payer thing, but each state has to set up their own market. Why? Why are we doing that? It's the same kind of pattern that we see again and again. So when I hear states' rights and stuff like that, I get pretty suspicious about the intentions or motivations going on there.
Quote that I think was like just before that, the one that you had read there, Joe. But in addition to the state, right? Like the state that administers this, the other approach, now I'm reading from the book, but the approach Rankin took combined complete federal funding with state and local control under the auspices of the Veterans Administration. And it also empowered private institutions, including banks and colleges, to offer services only to veterans they would choose to assist or admit. So it's like you've got the local, state, and government that is going to deny, and then local banks or colleges, right? You can say that it's completely colorblind. We're just leaving it up to the institution, right? It's their choice, right? Which was interesting. And then the part where after that, I think it goes into like how the historically Black colleges were built, like to try and address this gap or the fact that colleges wouldn't let Black people in. And then those colleges didn't have the funding or the space to even admit the amount of people. So it was like still like you're trying to stand this thing up to fix that, and it still is not adequate or equal with what others are receiving, I guess. It was kind of eye-opening there. Let me actually just read this quote. Despite some federal assistance for Black schools, the relative absence of support from Southern states left most Black colleges unable to take in all veterans who qualified. In 1947, some 20,000 eligible Black veterans could not find places even under incredibly crowded conditions. As many as 50,000 others might have sought admission had there been sufficient places. Insufficient housing in segregated communities was a large part of the problem. A survey of 21 of the Southern Black colleges, a recent analysis reports, indicated that 55% of all veteran applicants were turned away for lack of space, compared to about 28% for all colleges and universities. So almost double, or close to double, were turned away because they didn't have adequate funding. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they'd already served their purpose in the military. They'd gotten them to a level of literacy that was necessary to make use of them for the military purpose. And they technically have access to this GI Bill, which is great. But oh no, there's no room at these colleges that you want to go to. And we're not really funding the ones that do want you to go to them. Just getting kneecapped at every opportunity.
Yeah.
Like I said, when affirmative action was anti-Black, like they're specifically doing it to keep Black people in their place. And just a testament to the HBCU culture that's developed since then. Like, I totally understand like why HBCU culture is so big and vibrant and just like powerful and impressive to see. It's like, yeah, I can only imagine what it's like to be Black, but I would imagine that like if all of that history took place and you finally get the chance to go to a Black college and learn from Black professors and just sort of be in your culture and celebrate the intellectual tradition of your people, that's huge, like what they've been able to accomplish. I don't know. Be interested to hear Brittany's thoughts, I guess, about her time at Howard.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, like, yeah, my wife went to Howard University in DC, and I got to experience a lot of things going to her events and meeting with people. I can't remember the one organization she joined. It might have been Golden Key, but they had a lot of their professors come and speak, and these like really renowned like professors that have done amazing work. It was interesting. I felt like I almost shouldn't have been there, like a little bit, but at the same time, it was an opportunity that, I could see, I guess, a little bit of what that looked like. And it was pretty cool. And she made a ton of friends that we still keep in contact with. Yeah, I just have kind of like a wrap up of my thoughts.
Yes.
Before I do that, though, there was a quote in here. Yeah. So this was from, I think, chapter 3, and this was talking about how, like, during the war, people get these 2-week extended leave things. And so it was talking about the differences between white and Black soldiers and where they could go. The policy extended even to 2 weeks of rest and recreation. The Army offered many of its overseas troops. White soldiers were sent to top-tier resorts in Miami Beach, Hot Springs, Santa Barbara, and Lake Placid. Black soldiers had to make do with Chicago's Southside Pershing Hotel and Harlem's Hotel Teresa, but Lake Placid. So they're sending people like up to where I am. So I thought that was interesting.
People, just the ones with the right skin
Yes.
tone could go to Lake Placid.
Yeah. Yep. Not everybody. But I think my big thing I just wanted to mention on this was it was the way that Katznelson kind of called out the military, or I think it was a quote that he put in here, but it was like the model welfare system. I think you read that Joe for the GI Bill, but just in general, like experiencing time in the military, it's like, I don't know, a great example of socialism in a lot of ways, the way that they take care of people and the way that lower ranking members of the military get additional benefits because they don't get paid as much, right? It's a system that's very much set up to take care of everyone and keep them all happy, fed, and everything like that, specifically so that they can go make war. But, I just think that's an interesting concept because a lot of people probably don't think of it that way. And then, yeah, like I benefited from the GI Bill. I got a degree through that. I've gotten housing loans, like things that I wouldn't have qualified for sure. So it's, having gone through it and benefited from, these kind of policies, it's just interesting and a little disheartening just to read back. Like, I can only imagine if they were like, well, we're not going to give you the loan because you're, I don't know, 50% German or something like that. Like, just imagine like that, if that had occurred, if like, well, UMGC was like, we can't have you come here, right? Like, and that would be the same, like, where would I be now without those things? Like, I wouldn't have gotten a lot of the jobs I've gotten, without a degree. Personally, I think I resonate a lot with that chapter there.
I love that. That's really good personal insight. The kind of other thing I had was how, he wrote about how over like earlier, how like 1 million people, like it was like 1.2 million soldiers were Black in World War II. It was roughly 8 to 12% of soldiers, and how they totally just get ostracized from the home loans and the job training and these redlining and local racism, ensuring that these things take place. And it just seems very much like it definitely like gave rise to a post-war like white middle class, and how it's just directly traceable. And I guess what you're saying, even today, if you played that out, it still has consequences. And we can see how that then goes back like generations. And if families didn't have these degrees and families didn't have these things, it just creates these things that we take as like our world and our context, but it is not. It is institutionalized and developed intentionally. And it's all about solidarity. I think what we were talking about at the beginning with labor unions and people coming together and the history of that kind of wheel cycle coming in. And it's great that they have, we've been able to push this and have more rights. And I think we still need more, even more aggressive ones, obviously, very much more. But yeah, it was really, I don't know, the chapter was just really great. And it makes sense if it was like kind of the bedrock of his argument too.
I think they're just trying to pull some of those away from everybody. So that's fine.
Yeah. Take advantage of the opportunities if they're there. But yeah, understand, like, especially on a federal level, a lot of the opportunities offered are cynical devices used to lure people in for certain purposes. And like, we, as veterans of the military, we can understand that we were useful in a certain way, and we got, like, I don't feel like I owe the military anything anymore. You know what I mean? Like, I signed a contract, I did my time, it was a deal. Like, you get 5 years of my time, I get free college and a couple VA loans. Like, we're done. But it is important to realize that a lot of the opportunities that are available are not offered with compassionate intentions. I guess the intention behind the legislation, I think, is a darker story we need to be more aware of and sensitive to, and not just trust that when the federal government is saying, oh, we want to help people. I don't know. I hesitate to trust that statement from the feds, to be honest. An example of that, I thought about it last week, but also was reminded when I was listening to our first episode on this book, because I brought it up. Question: when was slavery abolished in the United States?
This is a trick question.
No.
Is it 2020? No. Is it not like 1860? Well, it's not going to be 1865, is it?
Yeah. That was the official date.
I just know that's the end of the Civil War.
Yeah.
But like the law that comes after that?
Yeah. Like, is that basically your thought too, Kodie?
Yeah, I was trying to remember. I thought there was something like the 13th Amendment. Did that actually abolish slavery, or did it like set the groundwork for? I couldn't remember, but I thought there was something funky there.
It was like, it's like accept as a punishment of crime or something. Like it abolished slavery.
Yeah. No, you guys figured out the trick in the question. The Civil War was fought and ended in 1865, after which the 13th Amendment was ratified into the Constitution, and this is the full text of the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. And that was the beginning of, the exception clause of the 13th Amendment is the beginning of a whole history of propaganda of pretending that slavery is gone when we're still basically doing slavery in practice. You have any person you convict of a crime can be forced to work against their will. That's what that means, right? And statistically, I don't know, the fact checker might correct these numbers on me, but the last time I've looked them up, this is roughly what the numbers are. The population of the United States as a percentage of the world population is like 5%. We have about 5% of the whole world's population in the United States. Out of the whole world's prison population, of all the prisoners in the world, about 25% of them are in the United States. We are such a drastically huge prison state. Like, we capture people, put them in cages, and force them to work. Still, to this day, you can look up a picture or video, many of them, of this year of people in chain gangs in prison suits picking cotton in fields in the South with correction officers on horses nearby. Very, very similar to a scene you would have seen 150 years ago. The only thing that's changed really is the way we talk about it and the way we implement it. Capitalists are still using free labor by predominantly black and brown people that is forced and is basically not paid. You might get like 30 or 40 cents an hour for your commissary or something. But yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to point us to at the end is like, are we sure we got rid of slavery? Because I don't think we did. I have a report from the ACLU. They did I put the link of it in our host chat last week. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, did a big report called Captive Labor, Exploitation of Incarcerated Workers. And it's a really big report with a lot of information, but a lot of it included surveys from incarcerated people who were asked about their working conditions and everything. And so a couple of stats from that report, 70% said they were not able to afford basic necessities with their prison wages. So the wages they get from their work, they still lack the ability to buy basic necessities. 64% said they felt concerned about their safety while working. 70% said they received no formal job training. And 76%, so 3/4 of them, report being forced to work or face additional punishment. So they were essentially offered an opportunity to work, and if they didn't take it, it was implied that they would face consequences if they didn't take that work. Yeah. Is that slavery? Because it sounds a lot like slavery to me.
Yeah.
And again, are we sure the South lost the Civil War? I don't know.
Yeah. I was thinking that Joe Arpaio, like whatever sheriff in Arizona, the same thing, like literally built, essentially like camps, right, in the Arizona desert in extreme heat, putting people out there on chain gangs too. It's also strange how comfortable people are with that concept. Like, I've had that conversation, or not that exact conversation, but how comfortable people are with like forced labor as punishment. And they don't see it as slavery. For a lot of people, they're like, well, you did a crime. And it's like, okay, what was the crime? And is this fit
Right.
that? Like, what are we doing here?
Like, I can't think of maybe like very, very extreme, like serial murderers or serial rapists or whatever. You could make a case for forced labor. I don't know,
Maybe
but
somebody that forces someone else to do labor.
now we're getting somewhere. But yeah, it's just any crime. You know, my family's starving, so I stole some groceries, got caught, sent to jail. Oh, now I'm a slave. What?
Yeah.
Like, this is what it has never changed. It's always been the case that we think we live in a free country. It's a slave country. We're just not the part of the country that suffers from that. So it's like out of sight, out of mind kind of thing.
John Oliver did a really good cover on, I think, the for-profit prison systems too. I'll have to find that episode, but yeah, that was pretty eye-opening for sure.
I read a really good book once called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and you went into the whole 13th Amendment and post the prison industrial complex and argues that it is essentially slavery to this day. And it kind of goes through like Bill Clinton's 1994 violent crimes bill, which like kind of really expanded like police and militarization and also the prison industrial complex, and how like from the 70s we rose from like a few 100,000 prisoners in the US to millions now, and how they produce like the percentages that they produce of like office furniture and small appliances like toasters and things like that is really high. And they get absolutely like some states, I think it's like actual all former like slave states like Alabama and Arkansas, I know pay like $0 now. And totally like Kodie, to your point just there is about disparity of like the prison population itself and why they're there. Like the Bill Clinton 1994 violent crimes bill gave rise to the 3-strike law. And so it's like, these people can have 2 strikes and the 3rd strike, and it can be like carrying a tiny bit of weed, or it could be like a traffic infraction. I know The Atlantic went into some article about this in some small town about how there's like, one sheriff and these people can't like afford tags and they're getting pulled over. And, it's creating this entire thing where the judge is then like, getting people to get into the prison system to create the money for it's just like a sick wheel, and for-profit prisons should totally stop. And the argument against it is like, look at these Netherlands kind of like regions where they have like apartments and they have cutlery. They're given knives, they're given like tools, and they actually have like music rooms where they can play instruments and express themselves. They have hobbies, they have job training, and then they're rehabilitated. And that's what we should have as a rehabilitation, not a for-profit $11 billion industry, whatever.
Maybe that's
Sorry
the
for the long
disconnect.
rant.
No. I think that's like super important, because like maybe that's the disconnect that people have like when they think of like, oh, if someone commits a crime, should they be forced to work? Maybe they're literally thinking of the guy that's like breaking rocks, right? Just to break rocks, not for anything else. Like just you're physically doing something hard for many hours as punishment. But maybe they're not catching the part where like, no, people are making money off this, off their labor. Like they are exploiting the opportunity that these people can be forced to work in order to make money that they don't see, and also doesn't help solve the problem of crime in the first place, right? Like maybe if all the money that was made off of this went into social programs to help, like maybe you could make an argument for it. But the way it's set up now, it's all about profit and greed.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to trace like who's getting these contracts and who's profiting off of this.
Yeah, that's my thing. Is like it's always been about punishment and profit. Like it's never about actually improving society. And like the narrative about punishment is kind of used to obscure the more important motive, which is profit. Like slavery as an institution existed because some Europeans saw some people with less technology in Africa and realized they could use their technology to take advantage of them and kidnap them and force them to work. That was the point. It wasn't about punishment. And then when it came to a war we had that was supposed to end that institution, they were like, how can we still continue to profit from this? Vagrancy, that's a crime. Loitering, that's a crime. Let's round up all these people that were just slaves last week, and now they're just criminals serving their time. Like, it's always been about the profit. Like, yeah, I get really upset thinking about it. And like, I don't know, I consider myself an abolitionist on things like this. Like, I don't think police forces and prisons should exist at all in a healthy society. I think when you take care of everyone's basic needs in an adequate way, that the problems those institutions are supposed to address more or less go away. And you can solve the really big issues on a community level in a way that makes sense. Like the indigenous communities that were here before we colonized the continent were doing just fine. But we'll get into that with the next book we read. So I don't want to get ahead of myself.
I was going to say, maybe we still need the white collar prisons though.
Yeah, whatever. Those are like, hey, you want a spa? There's an opening at 2. It's just disgusting.
Oh, so those are like the prisons that they've got in the Netherlands?
Yeah, totally. They should reverse them. And also like I don't know. I don't know if this goes into the episode at all, but just like the whole American myth of like we're taught at a young age about like good versus evil and superhero versus criminal. And if people are like criminals, they're just like inherently evil, unless it's like January 6th rioter or somebody who embezzled funds for hundreds of billions and like, gives a bit to Trump. It's like, then they're okay to be freed.
Right now.
Yeah. But all the minor infractions, it's like, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and just in terms of like prison culture and stuff, and like a lot of people have no encounter with incarcerated people. A lot of people like live their whole lives, and like you might be aware of a prison down the road from where you live or something, but like most people never go visit, don't have people that they need to visit there or whatever. I had an uncle who was in prison for a long time, and I went to visit him as a kid a handful of times with my mom, my grandpa, and stuff. So I saw a little bit of that from a young age. I do volunteer work now. I volunteer to teach meditation in the DC jails. And so I'm there pretty often. And like this narrative that, and even when you do the training to become a volunteer at an institution like that, you have to go through training and stuff. And they give you all this literature about how they're dangerous people, don't accept any gifts, don't accept any sort of quid pro quo, they'll try to take advantage of you. There's all that stuff about it. I've never for a second felt unsafe in those places. Like going through the gate, going through the security and all that stuff. It's like really intense airport security, and I feel a little nervous there just because the guards are like kind of aggressive and stuff. But in the units with the actual incarcerated people, they're just people. We're just sitting there having a conversation, talking about stuff. They're telling me about their relationships and how stressed out they are. They can't see their kids and how hard it is to be a good father when you're behind bars, and like really deeply felt human stories, human beings having human problems, and never for a second felt unsafe around any of those people. And I don't know, this narrative that like, we got to keep society protected from these dangerous criminals. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. I just see people who are suffering and sad and beaten down and just like want a better chance in life. Yeah, we just want to correct that narrative a little bit.
Yeah, totally. It's like the whole, it kind of goes into like the states' rights, like coded language. It's like law and order and street crime. It's like, I don't know if it's Reagan or Nixon, but it's a Republican who's voicing this stuff to not say black person, but say it without saying it. That's, yeah, a horrible narrative.
Anything we think to kind of close off the conversation, or?
I don't know. Solidarity?
Solidarity with your fellow human beings.
Yeah.
Except for the owners and the oligarchs. When they're on their knees, no solidarity.
I was thinking the other day, Joe, I think you made a comment. Well, actually, you made the comment today too, but just about, when you take care of the problems, that a lot of crime goes away. And I was just thinking about, there's still going to be those people that try to consolidate power and pull off like the more massive crimes, right? Like there is a sect of people. There is a group of people that are not quite right in the head for one reason or another. Maybe we can figure that out and fix that too. But yeah, like it just made me think of like the people that are in power making these kind of laws, right? Like that are seeking out to control others. So
yeah, I mean, addiction to power is the main psychological issue. Like when you have an individual who is addicted to power and tries to accumulate more and more and more power, that's a psychological condition we should treat and take care of and not normalize.
Yeah.
But we just totally normalized it and valorized it, really. Like just hustle culture, grind culture.
Yep.
It's set up to establish that. The goal is to be a boss and to control other people. It's not to live a happy life in fellowship with people.
Right.
It's totally backwards.
Make it better.
Join us next time when we wrap up Ira Katznelson's book and talk about his solutions, his ambivalence about reparations, and LBJ's kind of weird speech he delivered at Howard. So yeah, we'll wrap up everything in the next conversation about this book. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
propaganda loves you.